waning hours of Thanksgiving Eve, 1971, a Boeing 727 leaves Portland bound for Seattle. This plane and its passengers will become the most infamous skyjacking in American history. A man called D.B. Cooper by the news media jumped from the plane over dense forest carrying 4 parachutes and $200,000. Why is the crime still unsolved? Who is Cooper? Where is the money today?
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
The day before Thanksgiving 1971 was busy as usual for air traffic. The air corridor between Portland and Seattle was crowded. By mid-afternoon, the bulk of departing passengers had left Portland International Airport. At approximately 2 o'clock, a man calling himself Dan Cooper arrived at one of the 7 entrances to the terminal. As recreated for In Search of, he passed anonymously through the 2,500 people who still remained. Flight 305, a milk run originating in Washington, D.C., was on schedule for its quick stopover in Portland.
Passenger Warren Travers from Flight 728. Please pick up a white courtesy telephone.
Dan Cooper purchased a ticket with cash for the last leg of the flight, Portland to Seattle. The airline clerk who sold him his ticket did not take any special notice of Cooper. Later, through an error in newspaper reporting, he was incorrectly identified as D.B. Cooper, not Dan Cooper, a mistake which often continues to this day. At 2:30, boarding began for Flight 305. Cooper was the 36th passenger to board the plane.
Mr. Simpson, please report to the baggage pickup area.
Loading of both cargo and passengers was complete by 2:45. The 727 carrying Cooper and his fellow passengers swung out onto the airport runways in the early twilight. Portland Tower cleared Flight 305 for takeoff at 2:58 p.m. The plane was lifting off when Cooper approached the stewardess and gave her a note. It demanded $200,000 in $20 bills and 4 parachutes. Everything was to be delivered to him when the plane landed in Seattle. The skyjacker calling himself Cooper was the first American to hold a plane and its passengers for ransom. He established the dangerous precedent of air piracy for financial extortion, which is still copied by many terrorists today. But in Cooper's case, it was an act of pure greed. It was not a social protest, not an outcry for political justice. Cooper's only motivation was the money. The way in which he carried out his crime was coldly calculated. He reinforced his demands by opening a briefcase and showing the stewardess what appeared to be a bomb. The stewardess reported directly to the captain, who then communicated the skyjacker's demands to the airlines and the FAA. Ralph Himmelsbach, an FBI veteran with 29 years service, was notified of a skyjacking in progress. Flight 305 from Portland to Seattle normally takes 36 minutes. This day, it would last more than 2 hours. passengers on that flight were Richard and Barbara Simmons.
Well, they had asked us to remain in our seats, and of course, after 2 hours in the air, I felt an urge to go back to the men's restroom and got up and walked down the aisle and noticed the expression of the stewardess was rather horrified. She glanced first at me walking up the aisle, and then at D.B. Cooper and at the handbag by his side, and then back at me again as if, why are you doing what you're doing? But as I walked past her into the men's room, he turned around and looked very intently at me, and I got a pretty good look. I thought it rather strange that he was that interested in me. And so I got a pretty good impression of him. He was very alert and very much in command of the situation. He knew what was going on, and he was watching carefully every move of every passenger.
Meanwhile, law enforcement officers and airline officials were now preparing to meet Cooper's demands. Earl Cossey, a parachutist with 16 years experience and 3,200 jumps to his credit, was asked to supply the 4 parachutes Cooper wanted. By 3:34, Captain Robert Scott was circling the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, while airline officials collected the $200,000 from a group of Seattle banks. Cossey was quickly preparing the parachutes to be delivered to Cooper. By mistake, one was a ground training chute with its panels sewn shut, thus making it defective. At FBI headquarters, a furious effort was being made to record each serial number on the 10,000 $20 bills that would comprise the ransom demanded by Cooper. The plane finally landed in Seattle at 5:46 p.m. It was brought to a remote area of the runway.
When we finally did land, we landed way off in the far end of the field, which I felt was just a way that showed that he had engineered things so that there was just no possible thing that could have gotten in his way. He allowed the passengers to be unloaded, but kept them grouped out on the airport for close to 45 minutes in the wind and the cold and the rain. And a car met the airplane with the parachute and the money, and we were rumored that that was there. And but none of us were allowed to leave until that had all taken place, and then we were allowed slowly to walk across the airfield.
The flight crew and Cooper remained aboard the aircraft. At 7:36 p.m., the plane, refueled and prepared for flight, headed south in low clouds, wind, and showers. Cooper demanded that the landing gear be kept down, and displaying basic flight knowledge, he also ordered the wing flaps set at 15 degrees to slow the jet's speed. The Air Force scrambled jet fighters from McCord Air Force Base near Tacoma to follow the plane from a safe distance. Trying to find and follow a low-flying 727, even with radar vectors, is like trying to find the proverbial needle in a haystack. About 20 minutes later, Cooper ordered the entire crew to stay locked in the front of the plane. At 8:11 p.m., the crew felt a sudden change in the pressure throughout the plane. Because of the inclement weather, no one, including the Air Force jets, ever saw Cooper jump or a chute open. The territory in which Cooper jumped was to be searched by planes, helicopters, and trackers on foot. Both Washington and Oregon possess some of the most impenetrable forests in the country. That Cooper would pick these areas may provide clues to his identity. For the present, all we have is an artist's rendering of his face. Who was Cooper? Why has this skyjacking bedeviled investigators for so long? We will have to retrace the crime and analyze the incredibly complex strategy Cooper might have plotted. Meteorologists, expert parachutists, and the crew of Flight 305 were all questioned. That data and flight log information were fed into FBI computers. The FBI concluded that Cooper jumped in a 4 by 6 mile area near Merwin Dam. Merwin Dam, 313 feet high and 1,250 feet wide. It holds back the Lewis River in order to create Lake Merwin. When Cooper jumped, the dam was crowned with a series of brilliant lights. If Cooper could have caught some glimpse through the cloud layers, he would have been provided with an unmistakable landmark. He would have known exactly where he was. Les Nelson, sheriff of Cowlitz County, the supposed Cooper landing site, assisted FBI agents in coordinating the search by procuring a helicopter from Weyerhaeuser Paper Company in Longview, Washington.
We searched the area up the Lewis River to the south into Clark County and north side of into Cowlitz County and made several passes. We ran for several days there with an intensified search initially with patrol cars and some foot patrol, but basically just the overflight of both fixed wing and helicopters. We have had experience in the past with downed aircraft searching for different individuals, and we have had comparatively good success of spotting people from the air who were lost or incidents where we've had plane crashes. It's my belief that had this man made a safe jump and had pulled the ripcord on that chute and it had blossomed out, that we would have easily have spotted it from the air.
But if the chute caught in the trees and hung vertically, the chances for finding Cooper would have been minuscule. Searchers would have been looking for a 1 square foot white splotch in the more than 24 square miles they were searching. Cooper could not have landed in a more inhospitable place. The landscape is laced with bogs and thickets. Is it possible that just such a setting helped Cooper instead of hindering him? Frank Heil is a survival school expert who trains men working on the Alaskan pipeline. He is convinced that given the proper background, Cooper could easily survive in the wilderness.
I like to feel that with the clothing that I have on my back and the tools of survival that I carry in my pocket, that I could live indefinitely out here. Now, these tools of survival can be, of course, concealed in your pockets. No one would even know that you had them, and maybe this is what Cooper did. This area that supposedly Cooper came down in would be, in my way of thinking, an ideal area. I'd select it myself.
La Center, Washington. Population 420. A tiny farming community nestled in a pine forest. It and another town, Ariel, were the closest to the supposed drop site. On the night of November 24th, 1971, Cooper could have passed through the town unnoticed because everyone had crammed into the Evangelical Free Church to attend the wedding of their popular high school music teacher. While it is most likely that Cooper was not from southwestern Washington, it is possible that he knew the area and that he knew about the wedding. There is more. One highly questionable report concerns a light plane. People in this area claim that a small plane intermittently crisscrossed the skies over lonely farm fields near Ariel and La Center for a week preceding Cooper's jump. sometimes rendezvousing with a car. The mystery of who Cooper is may be unlocked by the man totally dedicated to finding the skyjacker. Ralph Himmelsbach, the FBI agent, still searches the area in his own plane. He believes Cooper was incapable of the intricate planning needed for the skyjacking.
I think he was a desperate man, possibly had a criminal background. He was probably not very well educated. He may have been in a service capacity. He was wearing the type of clothing that would be worn by perhaps a bartender or a waiter. We don't know who he was, where he came from, or where he went.
We may learn more about Cooper from the type of chute he chose. Earl Cossey, demonstrating the normal freestyle parachute, explains.
The type of parachute that D.B. Cooper used was a 28-foot parachute in a military-type container, and this type of container and harness would be very, very difficult as far as finding the ripcord goes. In selecting this type of parachute, it would seem that he had some military background. He would encounter numerous problems. Number one, as he exited the airplane, he's likely to go unstable, which would also cause him some problems in reaching and locating and finding his ripcord, aside from the fact that it was a night. Since it's rainy and windy, if he got the parachute open, then the problems of his landing would come up. I'm just sure if he pulled the ripcord, he made it.
The sketchy evidence leads us to a peculiar but quite plausible conclusion. During the Vietnam War, 727s were extensively used. They turned up at both civilian and military terminals, carrying supplies and personnel. The 727 pilots were drawn from both Air Force and civilian sources. Cooper could have been any one of these pilots. If so, he would have had a familiarity with military parachutes and survival techniques. Who was Cooper? Dr. David Hubbard, a psychiatrist and leading authority on the psychology of skyjackers, has interviewed most of the individuals who've been apprehended for skyjacking. Hubbard has drawn a personality portrait of who he thinks Cooper is.
As an individual, was a personal failure who had lost the capability of earning a living in our society. In actual fact, Cooper was an early, middle-aged, mentally deteriorated ex-aircraft pilot. He had flown clearly in the Vietnamese War and had undoubtedly taken part in the airdrops in which the tailgate of a 727 was used for dropping materiel.
The evidence suggests that Cooper must have had military experience to be able to plan and successfully execute such a crime. Some experts consider this theory irrelevant, insisting that Cooper never even survived his jump. 7 years after Cooper committed the first American skyjacking, a scrap of evidence of his possible survival was found. Carol Hicks is a hunter and woodsman.
While hunting with my hunting partner, I took off chasing a herd of elk. And as I was going through the woods, chasing these elk, which I never saw, of course, I was going through the brush, and lo and behold, there this piece of plastic was with some writing on it. I noticed that it was an emergency exit plaque. Of course, we collect the trash and stuff that we find in the woods, so I folded it up and put it in my pocket. The thought wasn't there about Cooper's plane, but I knew it was off an emergency exit off of a plane. I returned to where we started. While emptying my pockets into a trash container there, why, I remembered this was in my uppermost pocket, and I showed it to my hunting partner. And we decided that we should turn it over to the sheriff's department. My personal thoughts are that when Mr. Cooper opened the door on the back of that jet that he was sucked out and fell to a very, very cold death somewhere up in the mountains there.
For an instant, in February 1979, the police and FBI thought they had their man. 35-year-old Robert Wesley Rackstraw, arrested by the police on unrelated charges, was at first connected with the skyjacking. A few days later, law enforcement officers admitted he was completely cleared of the crime. To this day, Cooper, who he is, where he is, and where the $200,000 are, remain a mystery. The FBI's Ralph Himmelsbach admits that Cooper's true identity is still unknown.
He had to have been someone. He had to have had friends, family, associations, perhaps a job. He's missing. We don't know any more about him really now than we knew at that time. I expect that we'll keep looking from now on until we find him or find out what happened. We have a long memory. We build our reputation on perseverance. I can see no reason that would stop us from continuing the investigation to its conclusion.
A federal indictment has been handed down in Portland against Dan Cooper, John Doe, for air piracy and extortion. So far, not $1 of the ransom has ever been found, nor the existence of a Dan Cooper ever been proven. Sunrise at Mount Sinai. The mountain long thought to be the place where Moses received the Ten Commandments. Thousands of tourists come here each year, making the pilgrimage to the site of that great biblical event. Have they all been coming to the wrong place?
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
The wilderness of Sinai is a land sacred to Jews and Christians all over the world. According to the Bible, Moses received the Ten Commandments somewhere in the Sinai more than 3,000 years ago. A barren peninsula, ironically, it has long been one of the most strategic spots on Earth. The Sinai is the land bridge between Asia and Africa. Alexander the Great crossed it with his army in 7 days. Roman Emperor Titus took only 5. Modern armor rolls over it in a few hours. It has been fought over more than any other place in history. The Sinai is the same today as it was in the time of the Bible. Bedouin tribesmen lead a nomadic existence almost identical to that of the Israelites who went on the Exodus. How did the Israelites survive that famous passage through the Sinai? Modern Bedouin have learned that no single area can support them for long. It seems strange, therefore, that the Bible says more than 2 million Israelites were camped at Mount Sinai for 10 months. But where is the mountain? The search must begin with the Old Testament, which is where the story of the Exodus was first told. Moses was born in Egypt to a family of Hebrew slaves. When he was a teenager, he killed an Egyptian slave driver and fled into the wilderness. For 60 years, he lived in the desert, and as best we can tell, that desert was the Sinai. Moses spent those years as a shepherd, 60 years of solitude, 60 years during which he was exposed to the elemental forces of the desert. The Bible itself describes the time when Moses first arrived at Mount Sinai. And Moses led the flock unto the farthest end of the wilderness and came to the mountain of God. Moses was about to come upon the burning bush. A biblical legend says that he was looking for a stray from his flock on the holy mountain. His compassion for the young animal apparently convinced the Lord to speak. Draw not hither, put off thy shoes from thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. Moses had come face to face with his destiny. He was to return to Egypt, the place where he was born. As a humble shepherd, he would walk into the court of the most powerful monarch of his time and tell him on behalf of an invisible God to let my people go. The Pharaoh refused, and Egypt was assailed by 10 plagues. The last plague was said to be the slaying of the firstborn. Pharaoh was a firstborn son. Desperately, he went to Moses and told him to take his people and leave. The Bible tells us that 3 months later, the Israelites arrived at Mount Sinai. Moses was called to the mountain to receive the 10 Commandments. Where was Mount Sinai? No organized effort was made. No one tried to find it until 1,500 years had passed. By then, the earliest Chinese dynasties had been founded, Rome had risen to power, and Christ had lived and died. Soon after his death, the era of Christian pilgrimage began. Even though more than a millennium had passed since the time of the Exodus, some of those early pilgrims tried to identify Mount Sinai. One particular mountain in the southern Sinai attracted a great deal of attention. It was Jebel Musa, which is Arabic for the Mountain of Moses. 300 years after Christ was born, the monastery of Santa Caterina was founded on the slopes of Jebel Musa. Early Christian pilgrims believed this was the site of the burning bush. Local legend says it's still growing in the monastery courtyard. The first structure in Santa Caterina was the Church of Transfiguration. It was built in the 4th century by Helena, a woman who had devoted her life to identifying locations in the Bible. Helena agreed with Jebel Musa's designation as Mount Sinai. We don't know why. Thus, in the earliest centuries of Christian history, a speculative theory was accepted as an established fact. The Emperor Justinian also believed that Jebel Musa was Mount Sinai. In the 6th century, he added the monastery walls to protect the monks from invading Turks and Muslims. Until just a few years ago, these lifts were the only way in or out. They were raised and lowered from inside the monastery. Santa Caterina's Greek Orthodox monks have survived here for 16 centuries. Each monk prepares his own meals and is bound only by the daily schedule of 8 hours of prayer. The spiritual lives that are led in Santa Caterina end in the House of Bones. Every monk who ever died at Santa Caterina is here, presided over by Saint Stephen. Stephen was found in this position 1,500 years ago at the top of the steps of repentance near Jebel Musa's summit. He spent his life listening to visitors' confessions before they climbed to the top of the mountain. Jebel Musa looks down on a valley called Eraha, which means the resting place. If Jebel Musa is Mount Sinai, then the Israelites waited here while Moses climbed the mountain. The Bible says that Moses spent 40 days atop Mount Sinai. When he didn't return quickly enough, the Israelites below began to worship the golden calf. Building a false god so soon after the miracles of the Exodus was a terrible breach of faith. The monks of Santa Caterina believe the spot is marked with this natural form in the granite. The fact that the monks believe Jebel Musa is Mount Sinai doesn't make it so. Legend, no matter how old, is not proof. What exactly happened 1,600 years ago that caused Jebel Musa to be called Mount Sinai?
The first time we are hearing about Jebel Musa as Mount Sinai is in the Byzantine period. It means in the 4th century, the beginning of this period, while quite a lot of monks, hermits, came to the area of St. Catherine, what is now St. Catherine, and began to live there. And,
for almost 10 years, Avner Goren was in charge of all archaeological sites in the Sinai.
From the archaeological point of view, the difficulty in locating Mount Sinai is the fact that the children of Israel who left Egypt over 3,000 years ago were nomads, and like the Bedouin in Sinai in recent times, and the nomads left almost no remains behind them.
Goren is pointing out a basic problem. So far, no physical evidence of the Exodus has been found. What the Hebrew nomads left behind has probably vanished.
It means that even if Mount Moses or any other mountain was Mount Sinai, we will not discover any remains around it. And as archaeologists, we will never be able to say where was this mountain.
It is possible that Jebel Musa is Mount Sinai. It is also possible that Mount Sinai is any one of 1,000 other peaks in the peninsula. There is simply no proof to support Jebel Musa's claim as the holy mountain. Remains of the earliest Hebrews have been found 60 miles northwest of Santa Caterina in a place that was already called the Land of God at the time of the Exodus. Could this be the place where Moses received the 10 Commandments? Jericho was the first city the Israelites reached after they entered the Promised Land. Its archaeological remains are as old as the Exodus. The Israelites left no such remains when they crossed the Sinai. That makes retracing their steps extremely difficult. A common misconception holds that the Israelites spent 40 years wandering through the wilderness. But the Bible tells us they wandered in the Sinai for only 2 years. The other 38 years were spent at an oasis not far from the Promised Land. If we knew the route the Israelites followed, we would be much closer to locating Mount Sinai itself. There are different theories for the route of the Exodus, but they all share the same starting point. The northeastern section of the Nile Delta, what the Bible called the land of Goshen. The Hebrews had migrated to Egypt during a time of famine in their homeland. They prospered until there came to power a pharaoh who enslaved them to help rebuild Egypt after a devastating foreign occupation. One of the cities the Hebrew slaves built was the starting point of the Exodus. The city of Ramses was a bustling metropolis more than 3,000 years ago. If the generally accepted theory about the date of the Exodus is correct, the pharaoh confronted by Moses would have been Ramses II. Ramses built more cities and monuments than any other Egyptian monarch. As the third ruler of the 19th dynasty, he was the beneficiary of the pharaohs before him who had brought Egyptian culture to a peak of vibrancy and power. The Hebrew revolt must have come as a severe blow. By the time the Hebrew slaves left Egypt, they had undoubtedly absorbed a certain amount of Egyptian religion. The mountain in Sinai, where they went to receive the Ten Commandments, might have been an Egyptian place of worship, a mountain in the desert that was already sacred. There is such a place in the southern Sinai. In 1762, a Danish traveler named Karsten Niebuhr came to the southwestern Sinai and discovered what the Bedouin had always known. An Egyptian temple, almost 4,000 years old, was on a plateau called Serabit el Khadem.
In the Bible, the nickname, the second name for Mount Sinai is Mount of God. And in the Egyptian inscriptions in Serabit and also in other places in Egypt, the name of the same place is Land of God.
Zvi Ilan is a geographical historian at Tel Aviv University. He has just published a proposal which puts Mount Sinai at Serabit el Khadem.
This was, as we can imagine, the place of the holy mount that the Israelites, especially Moses, knew before, a religious center to the shepherds in the Sinai.
Serabit el Khadem is the only Egyptian temple in the entire Sinai. If the Hebrew slaves wanted to receive the Ten Commandments at a site already sacred, then Serabit el Khadem would have been the ideal location. The area has been a gathering point throughout the centuries. The desert floor below Serabit el Khadem is still used for an annual festival for Bedouin tribes from all parts of the Sinai. That means the Bedouin know this as an area that will support life. The Israelites may have known it too. The Bible says they were camped at Mount Sinai for 10 months. According to the figures, there must have been at least 2 million Israelites on the Exodus. Like the Bedouin, they would have known that they could survive here. The Egyptian temple at Serabit el-Khadem was begun approximately 700 years before the Exodus took place. The first part of the temple was the cave of Hathor, who was an important Egyptian deity. Hathor may have been the inspiration for the golden calf. Although she often appears as a human, that is not her most common form.
In some places in Egypt, you can see Hathor as a golden cow. For many generations, people thought that the origin of it is Egypt, maybe the bull Apis. But now, if I am right in suggesting Serabit as Mount Sinai, maybe that I can point something more realistic for the golden calf. I mean, Hathor itself.
While scholarly discussion centers on Hathor, the fundamental question is, were the Israelites here at all? Temple carvings show Semitic figures on foot, with Egyptians mounted on donkeys. The Semites in these carvings could have been the Hebrew slaves, since they are obviously subservient to the Egyptians. Still, there is far more startling evidence. It can be found about a mile from the temple. The entrance to the cave is inconspicuous, easy to miss. In fact, it was only discovered in the last part of the 19th century. Thousands of years ago, someone carved the first letters in history into the walls of this cave. These carvings are called the Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions. Most of the inscriptions ask for blessings from Hathor. They represent a landmark in human history because they were carved in characters that are the earliest forerunners of our own alphabet. What startled archaeologists was a second inscription in a cave nearby. It implied that religious Hebrews stood on this spot thousands of years ago. Inscribed on the wall were the characters for the word El, which is the name of the Hebrew God. The man who carved the name of the Hebrew God at Serabit el-Khadem lived approximately at the time of Moses. The inscriptions he left behind raise some intriguing questions. Were some of the inscriptions at Serabit el-Khadem made by the Israelites of the Exodus? And if so, are the caves of the inscriptions on Mount Sinai itself? One of the last verses in the Old Testament tells us that no man knows where Moses is buried. The same thing has held true for Mount Sinai. Now there is hope that we may soon identify the mountain where Moses changed the course of history. The Sinai has been the battleground for more than 50 invading armies since the beginning of recorded history. It has absorbed the ruins of ancient and modern chariots and the ghosts of countless soldiers. It has been an unyielding witness to the fleeting struggles of man and a silent guardian of his oldest religious mysteries. Soon, it may surrender one of its greatest secrets, the true location of Mount Sinai. nature's scheme of creatures, there is perhaps none so large and yet so primitive as the shark. During 63 million years of evolution, other species have changed or died. The shark alone has remained the same, a throwback to a time long before the dinosaurs. Yet, even within such an unchanging species, there exists one that is superior to the rest. To the handful of men who have seen it, it seems indestructible and immortal. While they may roam the waters of the world, unquestionably their favorite stalking grounds are those off Western Australia. It is here that In Search of cameras must go to seek out the great white shark. Is it possible to discover the secret of their survival?
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
Life on this planet sprang from the oceans. Here, too, the order of birth, life, death evolved. Yet in this womb of human existence, an anomaly exists. Sharks defy the normal pattern. They have few, if any, natural enemies, except one another. Native fishermen of the southern hemisphere know that the disposal of fish remains will instantly turn the normally placid tropical waters into a frantic feeding frenzy. This awesome sight validates the fear that sharks are the ocean's most savage creatures. Sharks threaten human life in waters throughout the world. Of those known to attack man, the great white is the most deadly and, strangely, the one that seems immortal. To find out whether or not the great white shark actually defies nature's laws, In Search of cameras venture to Western Australia. The whaling town of Albany was long known as a haven for the great white shark. Whalers were among the first to report the terror of the great whites. They were dumbfounded at the might of a beast capable of tearing huge chunks of blubber from the hapless whales as they were being hauled back to port. A sailor who might fall into these churning seas knew he could not survive. The whaling station at Albany is deserted now. Conservationists' outcry against the slaughter of whales forced virtually the entire Australian industry out of business. Once, deep-sea whalers landed tons of blubber on these docks. Once, the waters of the bay reeked with the smell of dead whales. The great whites had long come here for easy feeding, so we picked this site to begin our search. Hugh Edwards, famed Australian diver, knows the adventure and frustration of finding and filming the great white. Using the technique of native fishermen, one of Hugh's team creates a slick with fish remains and blood in hopes of luring the keen-smelling creature. Our goal is to film the beast in his own habitat. Scientists complain that they have little direct information about how the great white lives, how he attacks, how far he travels, and how he ages. For experts like Hugh Edwards, there's an unspoken excitement about the cat and mouse game of finding the sharks. He once tracked such a monster across more than 300 miles of ocean in 10 days. Like all experts, Hugh admits little is really known of the white.
Basically, they're a continental shelf shark, which is not deep water, but it's usually up to 30 or 40 miles from land. That's where the schools of tuna and squid and so on move. And the big whites tend to stay out there and very seldom come into shallow water at all. So people don't get to see them. I believe that a pregnant one has never been caught, for instance. Nobody knows how they mate. Nobody knows much about their habits at all, whether they're migratory, whether they move continuously. They're not often seen in numbers, although when the whales are in, they come in twos and threes and so on.
A dorsal fin announces the presence of a shark. Unfortunately, it is quickly evident that this is not a great white. The blue pointer, or mako shark, is almost as difficult to capture as its bigger and more powerful cousin. The men decide to kill the mako in hopes that its thrashing and blood will attract the real target. The shark is strapped to the side of the boat. Every precaution is taken to make sure that it does not slip away. Hugh Edwards is convinced that the mako is perfect bait. The team drops the shark cage over the side of the boat. It will be their only protection against the marauding monster of the ocean. As they suit up, Hugh remembers the first time he hunted the sea.
Oh, we started diving when we were kids at Rottnest Island after the war. In those days, we didn't have proper diving gear. We just read about the wartime frogmen and so on, so we had an old army gas mask. We had a hose we'd pinched from Mum's laundry. We stuck on the end of the gas mask thing. We used to hold that up as a snorkel, swim around, and we used to get funny effects with the eyepieces of the gas mask. So you could get double vision and things. So most of the time we swam with one eye closed.
A quick check of the surface tells the men that it's safe to get in and set the cage for the arrival of the great white. They strain to see any abnormal movement of the water that would signal the arrival. Suddenly, something forces the cage to sway. For a moment, the source remains unseen. He is 18 feet long. He is capable of swallowing the mako in 3 gulps. In a single snap, he can crush the shark cage and the men inside. He is able to tear holes in a boat's hull. This is the final view of what divers see before a great white closes in for the kill. Rodney Fox, famed diver and explorer, explains his encounter with just such a shark.
When all of a sudden a great thump came from behind me and my gun was knocked out of my hand, my mask off my face, and I was just hurled through the water at a great speed. I knew almost immediately that it had to be a shark and that I was in big trouble. And I remember vividly how the very quiet, smooth movement of the tail was hurling me through the water. I gouged as hard as I could around its eyes. I still don't know whether I got it or not, because its back jaw was around this area, front jaw here. Instinctively, I thrust my right hand out to try and push it away, and it disappeared into its mouth, cutting all over the bottom of the palm. My blood had stained the water all red, and as I looked down, I could see this big head with its mouth wide open coming up towards me. It is very difficult to see something so large in the water with hardly a movement of its tail, powering through without a sound. To know that they are the most dangerous species in your own mind before you actually see them puts an aura around them anyway. But when you're in the safety of the cages that I use and work and organise with the filming expeditions from, they have a beauty that is unbelievable.
We have now seen the great white and are better equipped to deal with the question, is he immortal? In order to discover the reason for the seeming indestructibility of the great white, In Search of went to SeaWorld in San Diego, where the only shark exhibit of its kind exists. Perhaps if we understand what has been learned about the evolution and physiology common to all sharks, we will have a clue to the long life of the great white. Ray Keyes, curator of fishes, acknowledges that most information about sharks has only recently been acquired.
Researchers at a California university have found out, examining the gray reef shark in the Pacific, that the animal goes through some very unusual behavioral changes before it attacks. It's actually signaling the intruder that perhaps it shouldn't be there. There's a dropping of the pectoral fins and a humping of the back and a swaying of the head. And then if the intruder does not leave, the attack will be triggered and commence, and it's very, very rapid. Of course, sharks are marvelous eating machines, and some of this has to do with the digestive system. Sharks have a rather short digestive tract, although they have, in some species, a short part of the intestine that has a huge surface area and allows greater digestion and absorption of nutrients to occur there. You would have to call them one of the world's foremost predators. They're extremely agile and able to collect just about any food that they care to. Sharks are unique in that the upper jaw does not have a permanent connection to the skull. In fact, the attachments are by ligaments and muscles, of course. And this allows the shark, when it is biting, to actually throw its jaw out more or less to grab prey. They don't have to roll over, as was once believed. They can actually attack a prey front on and protrude the jaw and secure the prey. Something that's come to light rather recently is that they have pits on their snout that allow them to pick up electrical potential created by muscular activity from other animals. This allows them to find prey that are sometimes hidden or even camouflaged. I really can't tell you a great deal about the aging process, and that there's just not a great deal known. Sharks are not well represented in the fossil record, and that they do not have the type of skeleton that allows them to be fossilized easily, at least. The bony fishes have what is called an otolith inside the ear, and layers are deposited on a daily basis. And by using micro technique, you can slice this bone and then you can count the layers and determine the age of the fish. Sharks don't have that, at least as far as we know. They do not have the same kind of layering in the scales that the bony fishes do that would allow us to use that technique. Sharks are very difficult to keep outside of the wild, and that our technology until only recently did not allow us to give them the proper conditions that allow them to succeed as these animals are. Now that the animals can be brought into the laboratory, we will be able to do some more accurate growth measurements. And we're hoping that we will be able to do something that will give us some idea about the longevity of these animals. And it appears that sharks are relatively long-lived. We do know that some bony fishes may live 70 or 80 years, and it would not be unreasonable to expect that a shark could at least equal or possibly exceed that. But at this point in time, we just really can't say a lot about the age of sharks.
For more definition, we went to Bill Gladstone, a marine biologist at New South Wales University in Sydney, Australia.
Very little, in fact, is known about these sharks, their lifespan. The smallest specimens ever been discovered or ever found was 4 foot long, which is large as far as sharks go. But as far as their lifespan go, they could live for at least 100 years, no one knows. Going on their large size, the largest shark so far found was 21 foot. So going on their size, they'd have to live for quite a long time. The exact time is not known, though. There is no information known about them at all. The fact that only another great white shark, or on rare occasions man, can kill a great white shark would seem to indicate that they're seemingly indestructible animals.
The thrill of confronting the great white shark has intrigued many divers. They know the risk of encountering a beast capable of bisecting a large sea lion with a single bite. An entire horse was once found in the belly of a great white. If this shark is capable of committing such savagery on large animals, one shudders at what it can do to man. What you're about to see is not pleasant, and it may be unsuitable for young children, but it is a true story. Henry Borse is a respected diver and explorer in Melbourne, Australia.
We had been fortunate enough to organize a trip to an island that hadn't been dived before. Something like 800 seals, I believe, lived there. We chartered a shark boat and 40 people on board. We were all interested in photography and collecting specimens. There were no spearfishermen or anything like that on board. I had been given a duty of staying on board on safety, and so was the girl that I was with at the time, which meant that I didn't go in the water till later. When I did, there were 3 of us went in the water. I took some film personally. When I ran out of film, we played with some seals. They're pretty friendly. They like to show off a lot and frolic around like circus actors. They're really good to be with. Suddenly these seals disappeared, and which gave me a nervous feeling because an instinct told me that something was wrong. You know, fish or seals or dolphins just don't go whoosh and disappear.
Henry was right. The seals and fish disappeared for good reason. A great white shark was on the attack.
I guess he had me down for about a minute and a half. It felt like about 45 days. It was incredible. But you're in such a deep shock at the time that time just passes quickly. He took the leg right off, just snapped it right off. And when it did come off, you know, I went straight for the surface because air was my first need.
No one thought Henry Borse would live. He did, and he still dives today. But each time he goes down, he knows that white death still waits.
The white shark, to me, is the only shark I've ever seen that does never show fear of anything. No, the only thing that I've seen stop a white shark is the things that divers use, like a power head, which will kill any shark. The other thing is the shark itself, other white pointers. When it comes to fighting over a piece of meat, you know, I've seen sharks have a go at each other. But other than that, I don't know of anything in the sea that will stop a white pointer. I've never seen a white, no matter what predicament he's placed in, to show fear. And I think this is what sets him aside from most other sharks.
Here is a magnificent creature with only one enemy, man, and then only if weapons are available. He grows to gigantic sizes in every ocean in the world. We must assume that the aging process does affect him, but we cannot prove it. What happens if he never dies? There is something incredibly primitive about the shark. His body systems are relatively simple. He must remain in constant motion, forcing water and oxygen through his open mouth, or die. He existed long before man, and every man throughout time has been struck by the same emotion when he sees him: fear, sometimes blind, sometimes irrational. For he is the only creature alive on Earth that man has yet to control. The 5th of December, 1872.
Ship on the starboard bow!
The captain of the brigantine Dei Gratia sights a ship in the Atlantic, 800 miles off the Portuguese coast. It appears to be unmanned and steering wild.
Ahoy there! Captain Briggs! Ahoy! Anyone aboard?
The only reply is an eerie creaking. No one appears on deck. The ship is completely forsaken. What happened to the crew of the Mary Celeste is one of the enduring mysteries of the sea.
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
We represent the government of the United States of America. We have permission from your government to board your vessel.
Today, Coast Guardsmen are accustomed to finding abandoned vessels.
Stand by and prepare to be boarded.
The first boarding is tense and dangerous.
Nosotros tenemos el permiso de su gobierno a abordar su barco.
Modern abandoned ships usually mean only one thing: they're being used for illegal drug traffic. In the days of the great sailing vessels, however, derelict ships were not so easily explained, and no abandoned vessel has remained as mysterious as the Mary Celeste. Theories abound as to why the Mary Celeste was abandoned. It might have been the result of a prearranged salvage fraud, pirates, mutiny, a burst of deadly marine gas, or even a homicidal maniac, killing the rest of the crew one by one, dumping their bodies, and then committing suicide. To try to unravel the web of intrigue surrounding the Mary Celeste, we must examine a reenactment of that fateful voyage in the winter of 1872. On November 2nd, in the New York harbor, the Mary Celeste completed loading her cargo, 1,700 barrels of alcohol. During the loading, 2 of the kegs slipped, damaging the longboat so severely it was put ashore as useless. A replacement could not be found, but the Mary Celeste still carried her yawl on deck. If absolutely necessary, it could accommodate the entire ship's company. The master, Captain Benjamin Spooner Briggs, brought his wife Sarah and 2-year-old daughter Sophia on board for the voyage. In his final letter to his mother, he wrote,
"It seems real home-like since Sarah and Sophia got here, and we enjoy our little quarters. Sophia has got over the bad cold she had when she came, and has a first-class appetite for hash and bread and butter. I think the voyage will do her lots of good. Our vessel is in beautiful trim, and I hope we shall have a fine passage."
To this, Sarah added,
"Benjamin thinks we've got a pretty peaceable crew this time all round, if they continue as they have begun."
The night before the Mary Celeste sailed, Captain Briggs dined with Captain David Reed Morehouse of the Dei Gratia.
This makes a change in this day and age, really.
The 2 ships were moored side by side at the dock.
Very slipshod about it all.
In light of subsequent events, this was a strange coincidence. The 2 men knew each other well. What did Captain Morehouse think of Briggs?
Briggs was a teetotaler and a God-fearing man. He could be stern when occasion required it, and was not a man to be intimidated or imposed upon. But he was just and considerate towards the men serving under him, just as he was gentle and affectionate in his family relations.
1, 2, 3, 4. 2, 3, 4.
On November 5th, 1872, the Mary Celeste set sail. One month later, she was sighted by the Dei Gratia. The Mary Celeste was drifting, unmanned, 800 miles off the Portuguese coast. She would be sailed by a skeleton crew from the Dei Gratia to Gibraltar, where the official inquiry was held. At the British Admiralty Court, the proceedings opened with Captain Morehouse's description of his first sighting of the Mary Celeste.
I reckon the way the yards were square, she was running before the wind when she was abandoned. It's possible the storm that we met at 4 o'clock that morning might have sent her round had she also met it. First time I saw her, 2 o'clock afternoon, her head was westward. The jib was trimmed on the port side, although she was on a starboard tack. She was yawing, coming up to the wind then, falling off. I judged something was amiss. I thought I saw a flag of distress at her yard, but subsequently it turned out to be a flapping sail. By 3 o'clock, we were about 350 yards off. I hailed her, but got no reply, and I couldn't see anyone on deck. So I sent Mr. Devereux, my second mate, over to board her, and in due course, he signaled me to come over myself. When I got on board, Mr. Devereux had already sounded the pumps, which showed she made little or no water.
During the next hour, Captain Morehouse would carefully inspect every inch of the ship.
The ship was perfectly sound. Her hull, masts, and yards were in good condition. Her cargo, which was barrels of alcohol, was properly stowed and hadn't shifted, but the forehatch had been lifted off.
This was only one of the many enigmas Morehouse would encounter.
I came to the conclusion that she'd been left in a panic. The mainsail was lying loose, as if it had been run down. The lazarette hatch was also off, but there were plenty of provisions and water in there.
Anybody below?
The glass on the compass was smashed.
Compass glass is smashed.
Together, we searched the ship from stem to stern. At first, we were worried that she was a fever ship and the crew had died of cholera, but there wasn't a soul on board, nor were there any visible signs of there having been any trouble. In the forecastle, oilskins, boots, and pipes were scattered about as if abandoned in great haste, and among the dunnage were articles of value you might have supposed their owners would have taken if abandoning ship. In the galley, everything was in good order, as it would be between meals. There was no wine, beer, or spirits on board. A child's clothing and toys were strewn about. And on the table was a sewing machine with a baby's pinafore on it and a number of small items lying on the table alongside. There were books and charts, but the chronometers and the ship's log were missing. The slate log had an unfinished letter beginning Fanny, my dear wife, Francis N.R., which I took to be the start of a message scribbled by the mate. The ship's boat was missing. You could see where the boat had been lashed across the main hatch, but that was not the right place for her. There were no signs of any tackle to launch her, but we usually launched our boat from the rail with only a tow rope to secure her. I saw no remains of painter or boat's rope fastened to the rail.
Captain Morehouse's observations were detailed, but they raised more questions than they answered. The man responsible for the official inquiry was Mr. Solly Flood, Her Majesty's Advocate General, proctor for the Queen in her Office of Admiralty, and a legal bloodhound. A new age of belief in science, invention, and technology was dawning. The ability to seek and find cold, hard evidence in order to solve any mystery was reaching a golden era. Was there any evidence to indicate foul play? The only facts available so far, a ship in good order, yet abandoned in a hurry. The investigation about to take place in Gibraltar would propel the Mary Celeste to her place as the most infamous abandoned ship in the history of the sea. Advocate General Solly Flood boarded the Mary Celeste to examine it in minute detail.
There was no appearance of fire or explosion or any other assignable cause of abandonment. She was well provisioned and it seems had encountered no seriously heavy weather. She was thoroughly sound, staunch, and strong, and in every way seaworthy and well found. But both bows had been recently cut by a sharp instrument. On the starboard topgallant rail, there were marks apparently of blood and a mark of a blow, apparently by a sharp axe. A sword appeared to me to exhibit traces of blood and to have been wiped before being returned to its scabbard. In the forehatch, a barrel, ostensibly of alcohol, appeared to have been tampered with. My object is to move the Board of Trade to take such action as they may think fit, to discover, if possible, the fate of the master, whose name was Briggs, his wife and child, and the crew of the derelict. My own theory, or guess, is that the crew got at the alcohol and in the fury of drunkenness murdered the master and his wife and child and the chief mate, that they then damaged the bows of the vessel so as to give it the appearance of having struck on some rocks or suffered some collision, with a view to inducing the master of any vessel which might pick them up if they saw her at some distance, not to think her worth attempting to save. And that they did, sometime between the 25th of November and the 5th of December, escape on board some vessel bound for some South or North American port or the West Indies.
Was this the real story? Mutiny and murder? The Advocate General was convinced he was on the trail of a sensational crime. Soon, the story spread to the newspapers of the world and began to read like a modern detective yarn. As the inquiry proceeded, however, it became increasingly evident that the Advocate General had let his imagination run wild. Blood was later found to be wrong on almost every statement he made. The forensic tests proved that the sinister, bloody sword was really an old bayonet used to mix paints, and the blood on the rail was only rust. The final results of the inquiry cleared Captain Morehouse and the Dei Gratia crew of piracy, and in fact, the Dei Gratia was awarded a portion of the salvage value. There, the story might have ended, but for an amazing discovery 30 years later. A young apprentice sailor was sent ashore to collect some sand at St. Paul's Rocks, a tiny island in the middle of the South Atlantic. He found a skeleton propped in the shade of a rock. Beside it, a bottle stuffed with a soiled and faded letter. A letter which told an amazing tale.
My ship struck these rocks at dawn 3 days ago. She sank immediately. Only I, of all her crew, reached the shore alive. I am dying of thirst. It has been a voyage of disaster. 3 deaths in 2 days. Then came the poison on the 7th day out. Ship helpless, and so for 3 days we lay. Knew we must ask assistance to take us to Gibraltar for crew. Early morning sighted small brig becalmed. Mate said, take her crew. Went aboard. Captain asked why we came. His wife and child were with him. We left no one on board. The brig was called Mary Celeste.
Years later, this tragic letter was brought to public attention in the London Daily Express. Was this at last the real clue to the mystery of the Mary Celeste? If so, why did the young sailor wait 9 years to publish the letter? Many people doubt its authenticity. It is just one of the hundreds of theories proposed during the last century. There is a universal sailor's superstition about ships born unlucky. And the Mary Celeste lived up to that superstition. From all the evidence collected, In Search of proposes a logical explanation. The Mary Celeste had been at sea for 8 days. The hatches had remained closed because at first the weather was stormy. Gradually, though, the cold November chill of New York gave way to the milder latitudes of the Azores. cargo of alcohol was stored in barrels made of red oak, an extremely porous wood. At least 8 of the barrels leaked badly during the voyage. Battened down under the hatches, the fumes mingled with the foul air of the hold. Was a potentially explosive mixture of gas forming? Off the Azores, the wind dropped to a gentle breeze. Taking advantage of the calm weather, Briggs probably ordered the ventilation of the hold, which may have set off a fateful chain of events. An upward rush of fumes, perhaps even an explosion. Then, steam, looking like smoke, poured out of the hatch.
Abandon ship!
Some of the men began to take in sail. Convinced that the ship was about to blow up, Briggs ordered the boat lowered. A sailor broke out a coil of rope as a tow line from the lazarette. Someone grabbed some tins of preserved meat. Briggs snatched up his chronometer and any of the ship's papers he could quickly lay his hands on. Feeling certain that time was of the essence, he urgently herded his family and crew to the yawl. According to meteorological reports, a sudden squall blew up that day. Under the impact of a violent gust, the vessel may have lunged forward with a suddenness and force which broke the improvised tow line. They may have tried to row after the Mary Celeste, or they may have turned toward the island of Santa Maria, a jagged, inhospitable coastline where a small boat and her occupants would easily be smashed to pieces in the surf. The wind shifted, however, so it seems more probable that the small boat was blown southeast, away from the island and out into the vast reaches of the Atlantic, to disappear forever. When the Mary Celeste was found on December 5th, the last entry on her log slate was for the morning of November 25th, 11 days earlier. This entry put the Mary Celeste 6 miles north of the island of Santa Maria in the Azores. With the set of her sails, and with no one at her helm, her natural course would be roughly at right angles to the wind. This presumably was how, over the 10 days, she covered the 750 miles between the last entry in the log and the position where she was first sighted by the Dei Gratia. What has been reenacted seems to be the most likely explanation. But whatever the cause of the panic, Captain Morehouse was certain of one thing.
Captain Briggs bore the highest character for seamanship and correctness, and would not, I think, desert his ship except to save his life.
The Mary Celeste became a marked ship. Sailors being superstitious, no one wanted to own her, sail her, or have anything to do with her. She was sold and resold rapidly at well below her commercial value. 13 years after the events we have described, she was deliberately wrecked by her owners in a failed insurance fraud scheme. On Rochelle's Reef off Haiti, she quickly broke up. And today, there is no more trace of her than there is of Captain Briggs and his crew of that fateful voyage of 1872. Lost civilizations, extraterrestrials, myths and monsters, missing persons, magic and witchcraft, unexplained phenomena. In Search of Cameras are traveling the world, seeking out these great mysteries. This program was the result of the work of scientists, researchers, and a group of highly skilled technicians. these dances, these masks, these strange rituals have meaning. They describe precisely the relationship between a remote African tribe and the heavens. This tribe believes all life comes from a distant dark star, invisible to the naked eye. Recently, modern science was able to find this star and confirm its existence. Now we must ask, how did a primitive people, lacking instruments of any kind, discover a dark star hidden deep in space?
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
In Central Africa, among fortress-like cliffs on the southern edge of the Sahara Desert, live a people called the Dogons. 1,000 years ago, fleeing from warring tribes, the Dogon found refuge here. The Dogon have endured and preserved mysterious ancient knowledge. Knowledge of an invisible star and its movements through the heavens. The hum of the bull roar is believed to be the voice of the sacred star. It calls initiates to a ceremony high in the cliffs. Dating back to a time when the Western world was locked in the Dark Ages, this ritual has taken place year after year. During the ceremony, the full spectrum of Dogon knowledge is revealed and passes from generation to generation. A circle within a circle depicts Saturn and its rings, which can only be seen with a telescope. A large circle and 4 satellites. The planet Jupiter and its moons. Most remarkable is this symbol. It represents the orbit of the Dogon star, a phenomenon deep in stellar space. Yet, no such orbiting star is visible from the Earth. It was not until this century that Western astronomers began to suspect its existence. A desert tribe called the Dogon, isolated in the African wilderness, may have identified a star invisible to the unaided eye. How is this possible? How could the Dogon possess this sophisticated astronomical information? Approximately 200,000 Dogon live in 300 villages scattered through their land. Throughout most of Africa, the simple melodies of the shepherd's flutes reflect the unchanging pattern of village life. On the surface, there is little to separate the Dogon from countless other tribes. What makes the Dogon different is a unique social harmony maintained by strong tradition. Among these people, murder, theft, and suicide is all but unknown. Greed is rare. Disputes are settled by debate in open forum. A goat has broken down a neighbor's wall and damaged his crops. The farmer demands repayment. The goat's owner insists it is the farmer's fault. He should have built a better wall. The elders decide that indeed the wall should be stronger, that both men should rebuild it and replant the crop. Millet beer marks the settlement. The Dogon believe in a perfectly ordered existence. They believe they are a part of something much greater than themselves. That each task, however menial, reaffirms their integral connection with the rhythm of the universe. In myths and symbols, the Dogon link the lowly with the lofty, the known with the unknown. All human activity is inscribed from the origin of man to the mystery of death. The spinning and weaving of cotton describes the Dogon myth of creation. Each strand by itself is of little importance, but united by a guiding intelligence, they become an ordered fabric. Planting, harvesting, the winnowing of grain from chaff, each act of Dogon life has a practical and a spiritual value. The study of the Dogon has lured men like Dr. Hans Guggenheim, an anthropologist from Harvard University. He has probed the relationship between the Dogon and their mysterious dark star.
In order to discover this mystery, the mystery of Dogon knowledge about the stars, we have to begin by looking at the inside of their granary. Because the Dogon link in their knowledge the science of growing grain and the understanding of the stars.
All ancient civilizations have needed knowledge of the heavens for the growing of grain. Just as ancient astronomers studied the positions of the sun, moon, and stars, Amendingi, the elder, climbs to a place among the rocks to observe the sun as it moves along a heelstone. He will determine the exact time when his people must sow the seed that will ensure their survival. This land is normally a desert. The rainy season is short. Planting must begin at precisely the right moment. The harvest which follows must last through the harsh months of drought. Life or death of the tribe depends on the accuracy of observation by men like Amendingi, the Dogon astronomer. As Amendingi studies the heavens, is it possible that he can reach beyond the visible universe? Is it possible that he can sense phenomena deep in space? The Hogan, the high priest of Eru, is the chief of Dogon religious knowledge. Selected more than 30 years ago by signs and prophecies, he lives a prisoner in a small temple compound. The Hogan is adored and provided for by his people, but cannot be touched by man or woman. He is the living repository of all that is known. His isolation from worldly needs and worldly concerns ensures that the sacred knowledge he keeps will remain pure. Should the Hogan be contaminated by human contact, he must be killed. Away from the clamor of village life, in caves and rock shelters, the teachings of the Hogan are renewed. Tribal legend tells us that beings called Numo descended from the sacred star and appeared before the Dogon ancestors. the Dogon were entrusted by the Numo with 366 symbols given without meaning. The Dogon were charged with interpreting them and preserving the information for future generations. The symbols reveal an astonishing scope of astronomical knowledge, an infinite number of stars and spiraling worlds. After more than 5 years among the Dogon people, Dr. Guggenheim has gradually gained the confidence of the Dogon elders and acceptance into the inner circle of secret knowledge.
The Dogon believe the universe was born in a vast explosion, and as it opened up, everything that we know about and everything that the Dogon know about in the world came pouring out, and nothing was left except a shell. This empty shell became the star that they call the Pontolo, and that we call Sirius B.
In 1950, astronomers confirmed the existence of the Dogon star. At the United States Naval Observatory, Washington, D.C., Chief Astronomer Dr. Irving Lindenblad devoted years to the search for the dark star.
The Sirius system is a very interesting challenge observationally because it is very difficult to observe a star 10 seconds from such a bright object as Sirius A.
After the years of effort, Dr. Lindenblad finally succeeded in taking this photograph of Sirius B and its giant companion. The Dogon possess even more startling information about the star they hold sacred. They say that when it gave forth all its energy, it collapsed in upon itself, becoming incredibly dense and so heavy that all the earthly beings combined cannot lift it. The San Fernando Observatory, Sylmar, California. Dr. Gary Chapman is an astronomer specializing in the physical characteristics of stars. By splitting the light collected from a distant star into colored bands, its physical characteristics can be analyzed.
The Sirius B is fairly normal in the surface layers, but we do rely on the calculations to tell us that the interior is essentially out of nuclear fuel. It's a dead star. We know from modern calculations that it has a very, very high density. It has a density about 5 million times that of water. And if you were to be on the surface of Sirius B right now, you'd be crushed very, very flat because the surface gravity is about 100 million times that of the Earth.
The symbol is explained. The knowledge preserved in rituals through the centuries has been confirmed. Beyond the Dogon knowledge of the dark star, the symbols reveal more information about the celestial universe. They correctly place the Earth and our solar system within the Milky Way and state correctly that the massive cluster of stars is far more distant than the planets. The understanding of astronomical movements led the Dogon to investigate the human anatomy. They discovered the circulation of blood in the body long before it was discovered by the English physician William Harvey in the 17th century. These symbols and the knowledge they hold are the legacy of the mysterious Numos, the messengers from the dark star. Many cultures claim their knowledge was given them by godlike beings descended from the heavens. But the Dogons insist their gods descended from one star in particular, which they're able to identify and describe in detail. Does other evidence exist of this encounter between gods and men? In 1937, French anthropologists shot this rare film of the Dogon. They found the people in a frenzy of preparation for a huge ceremony. The scientists were told the funeral of an important man would soon take place. But all this was an elaborate deception designed to protect their secret knowledge. The anthropologists counted themselves fortunate to have the opportunity to observe the making of ritual masks representing the panoply of Dogon spirits. It would be years before the scientists would understand their true meaning. The giant ritual which the anthropologists witnessed was not a funeral at all. It was the Sigi. Occurring every 60 years, the Sigi is the most important ceremony in Dogon life. The Sigi is an event relating directly to the sacred star. The Sigi marks the completion of an orbit, the time when Earth, the giant Sirius, and the sacred star are directly aligned, the moment when the Dogon and their star are closest. For Western science to determine the orbit of the Dogon star required calculations based on decades of astronomical observations. Minute shifts in the position of the giant Sirius led astronomers to suspect the gravitational influence of an unseen companion. When computer studies of the data were complete, they verified that a small star orbited Sirius every 60 years, exactly as the Dogon claimed.
The interesting thing is that in their vision of the stellar universe, they arrived at the conclusion that it was the smallest invisible star that was at the center of the universe, that moved the universe and that held Sirius, the Sigi Tolo, in place and determined its course in an elliptical way which they have painted and graphed on the walls of their caves, an ellipse which has been borne out by Western observations.
More than 4 decades have passed since the last Sigi. Only the oldest among the Dogon recall it, the greatest experience of their lives. It is from the citadel shrine of Yuga Dugaru that the order to commence the next Sigi will come. Here live the only men who claim they have actually seen the alignment between the Earth and the distant star. Elders of a secret society, they are the venerated guardians of the shrine, where they say a place in the cliff begins to glow when it is time for the Sigi ritual. What mysteries inspire these people to devote their lives to the keeping of a shrine, to the knotting of a rope measuring the time until a ceremony they will not live to see? In sanctuaries hidden among the cliffs, there is evidence of the antiquity of the Sigi ritual. The mask, called Na, dates from an early observation of the dark star. It is believed by scientists to be more than 300 years old. Masks for future rituals will be modeled on this example.
So what conclusion does one come to from the Dogon knowledge of the star Sirius? I feel there are one of 3 possibilities. A, that they have supernatural knowledge or extrasensory perception. B, perhaps they've been visited by creatures from outer space. Or C, that the whole thing is coincidence. And I must say, as a professional astronomer, I strongly side with item C, that it's coincidence.
How they managed to calculate this, we don't know. It is a mystery that we have been unable to solve and up to now, and that the Dogon are not going to tell us.
The average lifespan among the Dogon is 38 years. The Sigi ritual is held every 60 years. Yet, every Dogon youth learns the complicated movements of the dance, hoping he might someday participate in the ceremony. Each hopes that he will be the one to wear the grand mask. The grand mask, the symbol of the sacred star, turning in endless orbit around the giant Sirius. Today, the modern world surrounds the Dogon. Their children will attend schools. Roads will connect them to major cities. Western goods and technology will soon be commonplace. As they gain new knowledge, will they lose this ancient wisdom? Can they travel into the future, guided by tradition and social harmony? Will they retain the guiding wisdom of the dark star?